Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Vote Gun: How Gun Rights Became Politicized in the United States by Patrick J. Charles. Narrated by William Sarris. Preface. I originally intended Vote Gun to be completed in conjunction with my book Armed in America, A History of Gun Rights from Colonial Militias to Concealed Carry, 2018. Vote Gun was to be a macro history on the politicization of gun rights up through the elections in 2016. Yet, in conducting my research, I quickly learned that much, if not most, of the story had yet to be told, and a microhistory was warranted. Indeed, several academics and writers have written on the politicization of gun rights in the 20th century. What virtually all these academics and writers got wrong, however, was the historical timeline of events, particularly the point in time when firearms owners were effectively organized into a political force. The politicization of gun rights did not begin in the late 1960s or early 1970s, as these authors contend. Rather, it began 5 decades earlier after the passage of the New York Sullivan Act in 1911, which my book Armed in America definitively proves. Recently, Matthew Lacombe, in his book Firepower: How the NRA Turned Gun Owners into a Political Force, has shed additional light on this historical fallacy, one that Vote Gun seeks to dispel. As for why Vote Gun stops its historical examination at 1980, the reason is twofold. First, the history of gun rights post-1980 is so rich with historical research material that every decade will ultimately require its own volume. Second, and more important from a historiography standpoint, as it stands today, most post-1980 political collections and congressional papers are either heavily redacted or not yet open to researchers, which makes it extremely difficult for historians and academics to reconstruct any post-1980 political history with sufficient accuracy. The papers of former President Ronald Reagan are a principal case in point. But it is not just Reagan's papers. The same holds true for the papers of former President George H.W. Bush, to include items going as far back as the 1960s. Then there are the political papers of late Michigan Representative John D. Dingell, Jr., the longest-serving member in congressional history and a principal National Rifle Association, NRA, surrogate going back to the late 1950s. Although Dingell donated his political papers to the University of Michigan in 2015, and university archivists have cataloged said papers since as early as 2018, the Dingell estate has yet to formally approve their release. And when the papers are eventually released for public consumption, given that Dingell's spouse, Debbie Dingell, is a current member of Congress, researchers will almost assuredly find many items either partially redacted or withheld from public viewing altogether. Fortunately, the delayed release of Dingell's papers, although disappointing for researchers, including myself, did not negatively affect the historical content and findings in Vote Gun. The papers of 3 other NRA surrogates, Florida Representative Robert F. Sykes, Iowa Senator Bork B. Hickenlooper, and Nebraska Senator Roman L. Hruska, as well as several letters from Dingell that appeared in other political collections, provided more than sufficient material to historically reconstruct the machinations of gun rights advocacy through 1980. Vote Gun would not have been possible but for the help and assistance of many friends and family, colleagues, academics, and institutions. Beginning with the institutions, the staff at several archives and libraries proved invaluable. This includes the staff at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, Bob Dole Archives and Special Collections, Arizona State University, Herbert Hoover Presidential Library, Library of Congress, National Archives and Records Administration, Minnesota Historical Society, Rauner Special Collections Library, California State Archives, Hagley Archives, Wyoming American Heritage Center, Dirksen Center, Wesleyan University Special Collections and Archives, Edmund S. Muskie Archives and Special Collections, J. Willard Marriott Library Special Collections, Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library, University of Vermont Special Collections, Seeley G. Mudd Manuscript Library, Tulane University Howard Tilton Memorial Library, University of Virginia Special Collections, Vermont Historical Society, Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies, University of Idaho Special Collections, Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, Richard Nixon Presidential Library, Ohio State University Congressional Papers Archive, John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, Stony Brook University Special Collections and Archives, University of Maryland Special Collections, Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library, Briscoe Center of American History, Montana Historical Society, Arizona Historical Society, University of Montana Mansfield Library, University of West Florida Special Collections, Nebraska State Historical Society, University of North Carolina Lewis Round Wilson Special Collections Library, Pennsylvania Historical Society, Pennsylvania State University Special Collections, Willamette University Archives and Special Collections, University of Massachusetts Amherst Special Collections, Clemson University Special Collections, University of Connecticut Thomas J. Dodd Research Center, University of Pittsburgh Special Collections, University of Oregon Special Collections, and University of Washington Special Collections. The staff at most of these institutions took on the job of scanning and transmitting their respective collections for this project, albeit at a substantial personal financial cost. 5 institutions were particularly gracious during the research phase of Vote Gun. The Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library, $575. University of Oklahoma Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center, $1,000. And University of Michigan Bentley Historical Library, $2,000. Each provided travel grants, and their staff were extremely helpful in locating materials within their collections. Every Town for Gun Safety kindly provided a $5,000 research grant, which covered roughly 1/5 of all archival scanning costs. Last, the Second Amendment Foundation, SAF, generously provided copyright permission to reprint any Gun Week political cartoon in Vote Gun at no expense. Generally, obtaining copyright permission for just one political cartoon in a book can cost upwards of hundreds of dollars. Thankfully, SAF understood the broader academic benefit of republishing these cartoons. In addition to the assistance provided by several institutions and their staff, I am indebted to several professionals for their mentorship, guidance, and support over many years, particularly Joseph Blocker, Jake Charles, Mark Frassetto, Jordan Gusick, Matthew Lacombe, who was kind to share his research throughout the project, Carrie LeWine McCready, Alex McCready, Darrell A.H. Miller, Robert J. Spitzer, and Jennifer Tucker. Special thanks are due to my literary agent Alexa Stark and Trident Media Group for taking on this project, the late U.S. Senator Joseph D. Tidings for taking time to participate in a phone interview, my former colleagues in U.S. Senate, particularly Senator Martin Heinrich's office, for showing me how our political process operates behind the scenes, and my fellow United States Air Force, USAF, legislative fellows for providing similar insights from their respective experiences. And, of course, a special thanks to Stephen Wesley and Columbia University Press for seeing Vote Gun for what it is, a groundbreaking historical deep dive into the rise of gun rights in American politics. Finally, I want to thank my family, close friends, and colleagues and coworkers, especially within United States Special Operations Command, USSOCOM, and the wider Special Operations community for their continued help and support, as well as my late canine writing companions, AJ, 2003 to 2018, TJ, 2004 to 2020, and Benny, 2007 to 2021, adopted 2015, for listening to me write and think out loud for many years. Introduction. The anti-gun law can be intelligently viewed only from the standpoint of a public menace, wrote National Rifle Association, NRA, official C.B. Lister in 1924. It would be another 2 years before the NRA formally announced it was entering the fight against anti-gun laws, Yet Lister's quote succinctly summarizes how the NRA would characterize gun control for the rest of the century, and to this day remains a key talking point among gun rights advocates. To say the politics involving firearms is deeply emotional and polarizing would be an understatement. Much like the uses of immigration, abortion, and crime, the politics involving firearms are largely tribal. In one tribe are the proponents of gun rights. According to polling over the past quarter century, the prototypical member of the gun rights tribe is likely to be a non-college educated, rural white male. In another tribe are the proponents of gun control. Based on the same polling and surveys, the prototypical member of the gun control tribe is likely to be a college-educated, urban, non-white female. This is not to say that there are not non-college-educated, rural white males who support gun control, and college-educated, urban, non-white females who support gun rights. There most certainly are. But what the prototypical member of each tribe underscores is how much one's identity has come to define whether one supports gun rights or gun control. Just consider that non-college-educated rural white males are almost twice as likely to politically identify with conservatism and the Republican Party as with liberalism and the Democratic Party. The reverse is true of college-educated urban non-white females, who are twice as likely to politically identify with liberalism and the Democratic Party as with conservatism and the Republican Party. Needless to say, those who support gun rights are typically conservative and Republicans, and those who support gun control are typically liberal and Democrats. Supporters of either gun rights or gun control, of course, are not a political monolith. Far from it, as seen in recent years with the rise of all-black armed groups advocating for civil rights and legal reforms typically associated with today's liberals and the Democratic Party. But when one looks at the subject from a wider macro viewpoint, the political polarization is quite stark. As a recent Pew Research Center survey indicates, roughly 75% of self-identifying conservatives and Republicans place more importance on gun rights than on gun control. The exact opposite is true of self-identifying liberals and Democrats, roughly 75% of whom place more importance on gun control than on gun rights. The political polarization among proponents of gun rights and gun control, although commonplace today, is relatively recent. Throughout the 1960s and most of the 1970s, one's political party affiliation was in no way indicative of whether one favored gun rights over gun control or vice versa. This is not to say that there have not been any indicators as to whether a person was more likely to support gun rights over gun control, and vice versa. In the early to mid-19th century, for instance, one's understanding of what the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms constitutionally embodied, what were its limits, and how the right was understood to function in society, was largely regional. While those living in the northeastern United States were more likely than not to view the Second Amendment in strictly well-regulated militia terms, those living in the Deep South and rural West were more likely than not to view that amendment as being a bit more individualistic. As the United States entered the 20th century, however, these regional differences began to diminish as the concept of firearms localism became normalized and accepted across the country. Firearms localism is simply another way of saying that the proper way to balance the competing political interests of gun rights and gun control is to keep the issue localized. Essentially, firearms localism provided local government officials, who were believed to have a better understanding of the needs and concerns of their constituents than did state or federal officials, the discretion to properly weigh an individual's right to keep and bear arms with the wider public health and safety concerns of the community. Firearms localism first grew to prominence in the mid to late 19th century. During that time, the country was rapidly expanding westward, and as new urban and trading centers arose, firearms localism grew in popularity. Whether it was in a frontier gateway town like Dodge City, Kansas, the mining metropolis of San Francisco, California, or the burgeoning trading center of Dallas, Texas, there was little pushback among residents whenever lawmakers enacted ordinances restricting the ownership, use, sale, and carriage of firearms. Firearms restrictions that went beyond the city limits, however, were often criticized, and understandably so, given the general absence of law enforcement in those areas. Firearms localism was in fact so generally accepted that even the first gun rights movement endorsed the concept. Led by the efforts of the United States Revolver Association, USRA, a small organization dedicated to pistol marksmanship, and the editors of sporting, hunting, and shooting magazines, the first gun rights movement viewed firearms localism as the key to a sane approach to firearms regulation. Sane firearms regulation, according to the USRA, included laws requiring that all firearms purchases be recorded and registered, prohibiting criminals from owning or using firearms, prohibiting minors from purchasing firearms, and requiring enhanced mandatory sentencing for anyone using a firearm in the commission of a crime. Additionally, the first gun rights movement denounced with force the promiscuous carrying of firearms, particularly in public places, or what was otherwise referred to as gun-toting. The first gun rights movement did, however, support laws that permitted a person to obtain license to carry a firearm if that individual could show cause as to why they should go armed. Known more generally as may-issue concealed carry laws, today, due to the Supreme Court's recent opinion in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, such laws are inviolate of the Second Amendment. But this was not the case from the early to mid-20th century. If anything, both the courts and gun rights proponents saw may-issue concealed carry laws as an acceptable compromise to the legislative alternative of outright prohibition. There was also general agreement among early to mid-20th century sportsmen, hunters, and firearms owners that only persons who were adequately trained in handling firearms and could demonstrate a justifiable need to be publicly armed should do so. Support for firearms localism became even more prevalent after the NRA commandeered the gun rights movement in the late 1920s. Firearms localism was in fact one of the chief political talking points that the NRA used to fight against federal firearms controls from the early 1930s through the mid-1970s. Over that time, the NRA regularly argued that the regulating of firearms was a matter best reserved to the respective states and, constitutionally speaking, that any federal firearms regulatory power was limited in scope. In the mid to late 1960s, the NRA's argument became particularly appealing to conservatives and states' rights proponents, who generally opposed Congress's foray into civil rights legislation. Given the wide political appeal to this constituency, it is not surprising that conservative Republican Richard M. Nixon co-opted the concept of firearms localism for his presidential campaign in 1968. From that point on, albeit gradually, the cause of gun rights became increasingly tied to conservatism, the moral majority, and the Republican Party. This forever changed gun rights politics, for once the cause of gun rights became partisan, the concept of firearms localism was forced to gradually give way to the concept of gun rights nationalism, that is, the belief that Second Amendment rights are greater than or equal to other constitutional rights, and that such rights need uniform protection across the United States. Vote Gun examines this transformation primarily by exploring the rise, growth, and evolution of the gun rights movement. In doing so, it investigates the historical how and why gun rights politics entered American discourse, with a particular focus on the time frame 1968 to 1980. There are indeed other historical aspects of the gun rights movement explored throughout this book. Perhaps one of the most relevant, at least for today's increasingly politically polarized atmosphere and its interconnection with organized disinformation campaigns, is the frequency with which hyperboles and myths have consumed historical facts and scientific truths. This has long been the hallmark of the gun rights movement's ability to rouse sportsmen, hunters, shooters, and firearms owners to fight against firearms controls and to influence lawmakers to support gun rights over gun control. The point to be made is that political perception is often more important than the political reality. Whatever people politically perceive to be true will often end up overriding what is in fact true. 1. A shot sure to be heard around Congress. On November 6, 1968, with most of the Election Day ballots counted, the dust was settling on the composition of the 91st Congress. For the state of Pennsylvania, the results virtually mirrored those of the 90th Congress. All 24 of Pennsylvania's incumbents in the House of Representatives were re-elected, and from the 3 remaining open seats, each was won by the incumbent party. Only Pennsylvania's Senate seat, held by incumbent Democrat Joseph S. Clark, ended up flipping political parties. At first glance, considering the results of the presidential race in 1968, in which Republican Richard M. Nixon handily defeated Democrat Hubert H. Humphrey in the Electoral College, the defeat of Clark may not appear all that surprising. A closer look at the election tallies, however, uncovers an anomaly of sorts. For in Pennsylvania, not only did the total votes received by Democrat House candidates outnumber those for their Republican counterparts, but also in the presidential tally, it was Humphrey who handily beat Nixon by nearly 170,000 votes. Yet in the Senate, Clark failed to ride his fellow Democrats' political coattails and lost to Republican Richard S. Schweiker by more than 282,000 votes. Clark was, in fact, the only Democrat running for statewide office in Pennsylvania to lose that year. There are several reasons why Clark lost his Senate seat. One was his poor likability, even within the Democratic Party. It was no secret that Clark clashed with the long-term party patriarch, President Lyndon B. Johnson. This included Clark vocally opposing Johnson's foreign policy in Vietnam. There was also the problem of Clark's relatability among rural Pennsylvania voters. Even in the suburbs and urban areas, despite posting a positive voting record on workers' rights and civil liberties, Clark was not perceived to be the epitome of the typical blue-collar Pennsylvanian worker he professed to be fighting for. Rather, Clark was more commonly known for being financially well off, and he was not shy in boasting about this fact. Conversely, Clark's opponent, Schweiker, came from the working middle class. Schweiker, at 42, was widely viewed as the young, vibrant, and up-and-coming candidate with fresh political ideas. Clark was not. At 67, Clark was unflatteringly referred to by Schweiker on the campaign trail as the Model T candidate, a reference to the first mass-manufactured automobile by Ford Motor Company from 1908 to 1927. And in a televised debate, Schweiker wisecracked that Clark was trying to sell the programs of the 30s to solve the problems of the 70s. There are other reasons that help explain Clark's election defeat, but there is one that would affect the politics of both the state of Pennsylvania and the entire country for decades to come: Clark's unabashed support for firearms controls. And the sportsmen, hunters, shooters, and firearms owners who were active in Clark's defeat made sure to hold it up as proof positive that they were a powerful one-issue voting bloc, and that supporting firearms controls was a losing campaign issue. For instance, in one Pennsylvania county newspaper, outdoor columnist and gun rights supporter Del Kerr touted Clark's defeat as a vanquished victory, not only for those who cherish the right to bear arms, but for all people who believe in American freedoms. Kerr added, "Never again will sportsmen be considered a minority group. In the future, many hopeful politicians will visit gun clubs as an important part of their campaign." Similarly, in an opinion editorial published in the Philadelphia Inquirer, another gun rights supporter noted that Clark's defeat will come as a warning to candidates in future state elections when they confront the carefully built-up animosity of the 998,000 licensed hunters in Pennsylvania. Although these election forecasts were embellished, they were not technically wrong. For from that point onward, whispers of the powerful gun lobby in elections became the norm. This is a significant historical development, because up to that point in American politics, whether a political candidate supported or opposed firearms controls was generally a non-issue, at least in campaign advertisements, speeches, and policy positions. In fact, it was not until 1966 that firearms control was recognized as a potential election cycle issue, albeit in a limited capacity. This changed in the wake of the 1968 elections. Certainly, Congress, having recently passed the Gun Control Act, the first major federal firearms laws in over 30 years, was also an important factor in bringing about this political change. It should be noted, however, that for decades, sportsmen, hunting, conservation, and shooting organizations had been calling on members to oust from office any politicians who supported firearms control, regardless of party affiliation. But until 1968, these calls for political action had not borne any fruit. Clark's defeat changed that perception, and in its wake, gun rights advocacy was able to politically morph and take on a new purpose, affecting election outcomes. For Pennsylvania sportsmen, hunters, and firearms owners, Clark's defeat was not merely some flash-in-the-pan, grassroots political advocacy effort. The politics of firearms controls was something that Pennsylvania's representatives, senators, and governors had wrestled with for many years. Since 1931, when the Pennsylvania Assembly joined several other states in passing the Uniform Firearms Act, which was model state legislation drafted by both the National Conference of Commissioners, NCC, and the National Rifle Association, NRA, the firearms control issue was known to be a political lightning rod. Whenever a Pennsylvania lawmaker proposed restrictive firearms legislation, sporting, hunting, conservation, and shooting organizations, such as the Pennsylvania Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs, PFSC, the Pennsylvania Rifle and Pistol Association, PRPA, and even the state-run Pennsylvania Game Commission, PGC, through the print medium of newsletters, membership magazines, and journals, urged their respective members to take the necessary political action to defeat its passage. Hyperboles, half-truths, and even conspiracy theories about anyone who supported firearms controls were a regular occurrence. Consider the July 1963 edition of the PGC's Pennsylvania Game News. In it was an article by Jim Varner titled, "Sportsmen, Help Crush Anti-Firearms Propaganda," where Varner called on PGC members to eradicate the double-crossers in our society who seek to eliminate the American heritage and prevent red-blooded youngsters from learning how to use a firearm. In delivering his call to political action, he claimed that the subversive trend of firearms control propaganda was becoming more pervasive than ever, propaganda that was formulated by dangerous, un-American groups. He went on to assert that the groups were orchestrating a three-pronged attack on Americans' Second Amendment rights. The first prong was infiltrating leading publications' editorial staffs, with the primary purpose of writing favorably about firearms controls. The second was encouraging TV affiliates to frequently report on homicides committed with firearms, which in turn was intended to foster an anti-firearms bias among TV viewers. The third prong was encouraging lawmakers to take up the mantle of firearms controls, and in the process, ignore the Americans' constitutional rights in every way. Although Varner firmly believed that dangerous un-American groups were the ones responsible for conjuring up this anti-firearms propaganda, he placed the principal blame on the media for its dissemination. It is strikingly peculiar that certain segments of our national press appear intent on abridging any of these freedoms. One would think that members of the Fourth Estate, considering their long battle to preserve their own freedom from censorship and government control, would realize that any restriction imposed on any of the articles of the Bill of Rights is a two-edged sword that might also be applied to others. For more than 3 decades, in Pennsylvania as well as across the country, the practice of sporting, hunting, conservation, and shooting organizations urging their membership to take political action against firearms controls continued largely unabated. That is, until the assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, brought the American public.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?